Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Shelley here. Welcome back to the Shareable Wave. In our continuing research and exploration of consciousness, the cosmic mind, and the continuity between and across lives, we are, of course, so very blessed to have with us today Dan Winter. Dan notably is responsible for countless breakthroughs in this and many other fields of study. And as you all know, Dan draws upon not only rigorous scientific empirical models, but also has a lifetime of fascinating anecdotal insights. So welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss near-death experiences, or even death experience if you wanted to cross over that line.
I so much enjoy playing with you, Shelley. You're so fun. You've been so dedicated, and we work with you on the Therify and the Quantify, the Plasma Fire, all our good toys, and the Flame in Mind. Shelley has been just a hero in terms of putting these things together and actually getting out there and trying it. And I always enjoy our conversations, Shelley. Happy to be here.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. So, I don't know where you want to go, but we probably can't ignore the brain and heart coherent factor here.
Well, yes.
So, go ahead.
Yes, and actually, so you said you're working with the organization working on near-death experience.
Yes.
And that you had been, you also working on the addiction issue, right? Is that?
Yes, that's right. So for the past 6 months, I've been focused on addictions counseling. However, as we will know, that often brings us into near-death experiences, overdosing, and so on. And then maybe we'll even touch upon guilt as opposed to accountability. But now I've just jumped like 40 minutes ahead here. So you catch us up a little bit.
But I think it's a relevant connection here, a relevant connection, that the work we've done regarding addiction, which has a lot to do with our Flame and Mind system. My original teacher of brainwave neurofeedback, the famous Dr. Marty Woodkey, he was an expert on addiction training, and that's how I got started in brainwave biofeedback. And recently we made a film about addiction and Therify and brainwave biofeedback. And the short summary, the 2-cent abstract, as it were, relates to, I think, what we want to talk about in near-death experience, specifically in this way. When we were studying addiction training, we learned, we told the story many times, that when somebody learns how to make alpha in their brain waves,
yes,
they're learning a form of compression. They compress and embed with the Schumann harmonics around 8 hertz. And the famous joke is that on the day the beer drinker learns to make his own alpha in his own brainwaves, the next drink of beer won't taste good. That's the story from that film. Now, what does that mean, actually? and again, oversimplifying, but the alpha beta resonances in the brain, and you get that harmonic cascade in your brainwaves, it creates implosive compression, which brings you to that famous still point. Now think, death experience, still point, what does that mean? So the addict, we always said, is made a wrong turn on the right road. In other words, they were willing to risk death in order to get a peak experience, like your kids wanting sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You respect your kids for knowing that if they don't get bliss, their immune system doesn't get turned on, and effectively it's fatal not to have bliss experience. In fact, it's a death experience not to have a bliss experience. Isn't it? So the way they risk their lives in order to get bliss with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or whatever kind of decadence is out there, is because your body is so powerfully programmed to know that it must reach that implosive compression still point, which could be called bliss, it could be called death, it could be called orgasm, it could be called kundalini. In each case, it's like living inside a lightning bolt. And when you're inside that lightning bolt, you can see forever.
Right.
So first of all, the first point to be made is, so when you use brainwave biofeedback to teach people to make that implosive compression, initially simply alpha, and then alpha and beta, at golden ratio to frequencies in their brainwaves. The caduceus completes, the brain implosively compresses, and you get that peak experience that everybody's willing to risk their lives to get. So, and when people have access to a form of real empowering bliss, there is no danger of addiction or drugs or anything like that. That's why we always said the definition of culture is, do you know how to teach your kids how to have a bliss experience? Simple, right?
So simple.
So, but now let's apply what we've learned about addiction remission and brainwave training to the study of the physics of successful death.
Yes.
That was a connection we're supposed to make here. And for that, we need that little interlude here. Now, we've always talked about, in the spiritual traditions, all of them, they talk about some realm, call it heaven, hey ave, or plains of Sharon, where the breath of charge takes flight. Lawrence Gardner said the plains of Sharon are the infinite electron shells unpacked of monoatomic gold. Well, it's a perfectly fractal charge distribution array, obviously, which somehow has to do with, where is heaven? Now, I'm an electrical engineer looking at this question saying, wait, there must be some physics here. And well, of course, we were all very inspired when Jodie Foster, in order to do contact, she gets inside a dodecahedron. Hello? And then she has a lucid dream and talks to her father, and this was the perfect trip. And it's a famous movie. Well, why was it a dodecahedron? Why did the dodecahedron enable her lucid dream?
Yes, let's answer that.
Well, now let's try to do a little flavor of electrical engineering here, since that is what I am, supposedly. We were very proud recently when our wonderful friend Maya, who runs Therify projects in Athens and Paris, reported in detail, one of the more recent Therify blogs, that her Therify work enabled a pretty dramatic increase in ability to lucid dream for herself. She reported on it in some detail. We were proud of that because here's the physics. See, we believe that a certain kind of electrical compression is what enables you to get into that perfect fractal distribution, a grid like Jodie Foster's dodeca. And we have a name for that, actually, in physics. And we call it, and you've heard me say this many times, it's probably getting boring for you, but it's called longitudinal interferometry. Now, this is important because we're now going to do the Egyptian Ba from the Ka here.
I was coming there.
Yeah, Kaaba, as it were. So remember, the Ka is the amount of coherence in your aura. Very simple. That's called your boat into the underworld. But the Ba comes out of the Ka like a seed from a husk in the famous Egyptian myth, which is good physics, because if you understand the relationship of the transverse propagation of electromagnetics versus longitudinal compressional propagation. So remember, all of our, I've said this many times, but all of our radio and communications, everything we use for electromagnetics takes advantage of the transverse up and down component of the electromagnetic wave, and none of our technology for using electromagnetic propagation uses the longitudinal compression component. Why? Because physics doesn't know how to get there. Hello? But they don't know how to compress well. I mean, and now Tom Bearden has announced, Gravitobiology, new famous book, that the compressional wave, longitudinal, incorrectly called scalar or torsional, is actually how gravity is propagated. So it's a gravity wave. Oh, great. So physics, let's ask them what a gravity wave is. Oh, well, they don't have a clue what causes gravity waves because they don't have a clue what causes an object to fall to the ground. So we can't ask our local physicist because he doesn't know. But yet this is the key to getting through death, it appears.
Yes.
So we need to just understand a little bit about this longitudinal wave propagation, this compression wave. Remember the famous story of the tsunami. As the tsunami is going through the ocean, it's a compressional wave going at the speed of a jet plane. It's a compressional longitudinal. But then, and when you're a boat on the surface, you don't feel nothing. The tsunami just went underneath you and you don't even know because it's a compression wave. Just like a longitudinal wave goes through a Faraday cage, no problem. Hello.
It does.
And about anything else, actually.
Yeah.
But when the longitudinal compressional tsunami reaches the shore, it goes up an inclined plane, the side of a vortex, as it were. And then the compression wave suddenly meets the side of this cone and it translates its inertia from compressional to transverse, up and down motion. So when the compression wave reaches the shore, suddenly it's going up and down, and then it'll kill you, as tsunamis do. So the same is true of longitudinal waves. When these compression waves cross at a distance with another longitudinal wave in a fractal array, suddenly it resynthesizes the transverse component, and you can create action at a distance, which Einstein called spooky because he didn't understand.
I gotta love that guy.
Well, and people say, you know, you're not very kind insulting. I'm not insulting Einstein. He was brilliant, wonderful contribution, but he didn't figure out why an object falls to the ground. And unfortunately, we need to know if we want to make it through death. So I just...
Yeah, carry on. No, finish.
There's another fun clue here. The next fun clue is Bruce Cathy is famously wandering on the planet. And he says, oh yeah, on this grid around the planet, that if you divide the circumference of the planet by the speed of light, you get an array of nodes, which we now know as dodecaecosa, Earth grid magnetic line cross points. The only place you can put a cozy ref mirror if you want telepathy, if you want to, or the only place the Kogi can go to make phone calls to the ancestors is where these magnetic lines cross and the air gets fractal, Korotkov measured. But what Cathy measured was that at these nodes of the magnetic grid, the nuclear critical mass was decreased. In other words, remember the first radioactive bomb was called implosion because the compression was symmetric enough to reach in to the inertia at the center of the nucleus. And a compression wave can do that, which is longitudinal. A transverse? No. So what's the reason why every cathedral, labyrinth, cozy rev mirror, and really any good Agnihotra and any phone call to ancestor if you're Aboriginal, every one of them has to be placed right at those nodes of the Earth grid magnetic lines, which are dodecaecosa, and where DNA radio works, and where gravity waves actually bounce. And the only place Jodie Foster could go to make her phone call to ancestors. So what I'm saying, this is just an introduction. I've been teaching longitudinal interferometry as a physics with spiritual science for 10 years and with hundreds of videos at fractalfield.com. So let's now go to the death question. So she's smiling. I must be going the right direction.
No, you are, but okay, carry on.
Well, so how do you reach in to this longitudinal array, which Aboriginals will call ancestor memory, Christians call it the collective unconscious, you know, they call it the communion of saints. Actually, Jung called it the collective unconscious. Christians call it the communion of saints. But I say it's physics. And it's the physics of a certain kind of electromagnetic propagation, which is communication efficient. Remember, just before they put him in jail, the inventor of global scaling, Hartmut Mueller, had developed mobile phones that had instantaneous global communication based on phase conjugate longitudinal interferometry. It's like DNA radio. We probably wouldn't even need, the G5 cell phones if we understood DNA radio.
Yeah, that's where we want to get to.
Exactly. We want to understand DNA radio, but we don't need this electrosmog stuff that's killing us. So how do you reach in to DNA radio so effectively that you can make ancestor phone calls? We've measured the physics of how you get their fractality in the air, Korotkov, et cetera, that you can take memory through death, that you emerge from addiction, that you have your bliss experience, whether it's birth or death. Here's the way to get there.
Yes.
So let's study the physics of death now. This is, where we get to. Now, I've got a lot of pictures on the web. The pictures are, by the way, all at goldenmean.info/immortality. we could bring up the pictures here, but let's do the conversation first. But you can look at the pictures. So here's what we figured out after years and years of studying near-death experience. The famous Heinrich Kluwe had measured the Heinrich Kluwe form constants. Maybe share screen. Maybe we should do this here. Share screen, desktop one. Okay, here's desktop one. Okay, and now I'm going to bring up goldenmean.info/immortality. Here we go. Okay. Can you see my screen a little bit here?
Yeah, perfect, perfect.
Okay. So the toys are working. Okay, so this is De Sela, the soul. This is Korotkov measuring the electric field of the soul, which is how plasma propagates after death and ghosts, and it's all good stuff. It's a fun little article. And this is where do you go when you die? It looks like a pine cone to me. No, it's a perfect implosive compression, and that's the point here. So Heinrich Kluwe, here we go. So Heinrich Kluwe, obviously, he interviewed dozens, if not hundreds, of near-death experiences and a few LSD experiences, I think.
Right.
And he also, well, when you're dying, what did you see? Well, I saw a lattice and then a cobweb and then a tunnel and then the spiral. You've heard me say this many times. And then we call this a map to the symmetry of successful death. And we learned why that's what you see when you die, because that's the implosive symmetry operations your DNA has to do to enter recursive braiding, yes, which is how you get to the next dimension, literally, which is to say how you implode charge and propagate from transverse to longitudinal. Well, let's now talk about our famous friend, Dr. Ray Moody, whom I love the guy. He's very sweet, and he teaches us. He's great. I work with him in Italy. He's done great work. Oops, I had to tell Carl Lieber here, sorry. So he was interviewing the medical doctors, the surgeons, about what happens when people die. And he published books on this. It's quite famous. And the short summary is he proved that medical doctors are convinced that death visions are electrically contagious.
Yes, absolutely. It's vicarious near-death experience or empathic.
Yes, exactly. And what is that physics? In my view, it is that the body is assembling what I call an electrical plasma black hole in order to enable successful death. Now, you notice when people die in nature and you take a photograph, you can see the spirit leaving the body. That's pictures the way I showed it to couch. It's very common. But if they die in the big city, or if they die in electrosmog hospital.
Yeah.
So what the physics we believe is that the body, your body is aura, is very attached to the physics of immortality. Your body knows the way to get to immortality. Your body actually knows. So if the conditions of death are very relaxed, and there's good life force and charge, like a magnetic line, a sacred space, the altar at Machu Picchu is a great place for birth or death, by the way. Good physics there. A hospital? No, that's horrible. That's called hell, because it's charge distribution inefficiency. And you need charge distribution efficiency, which is literally sacred space, where the air is fractal and where compression is possible. And compression is what you need because. So the body is trying to set up this electrical black hole in order to get you and your memory through death. How and why? Well, again, you've seen me do the physics many times. I guess I'll share the screen one more time, okay, here. But now I'm referring to this article. It's called, do I have it up here?
This is awesome. And if this is the one with the Holy Grail turning inside out, you know.
Well, that's also a good image. But the image I was going to show here also was,
that's the one actually, but the live animation. But anyways, carry on.
Yes. Well, so
that's this one right there. Yeah.
Yes. So that's the Grail animation, and that's fractal. And also, see right there in that slide, we're relating it to my new equation, which proved how hydrogen was fractal, and therefore how hydrogen makes gravity, and that's that other physics. And this is all the physics from the fractalfield.com/vacuum energy website at which I did the presentation on zero-point energy at the International Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference. And this is where we're talking about the physics of ascension, of how you literally get to the next dimension. In fact, I have another version of that slide right here, if I can find here. Yeah, this is a little bit better. Okay. So you see, the transverse wave here is where the electromagnetism goes up and down. You've seen this many times. But when the up and down motion goes down the perfect spiral on the cone, which is 5 spirals on a 60-degree cone, which is the way into dodeca, the side view is the caduceus of Hermes, which is called phase conjugation in physics. And when that inertia up and down enters that cone and traverses that optimized translation of vorticity spin path to the 0 point, that up and down inertia is translated non-destructively and squirts out the mouth of the toothpaste tube. And that mouth is, the dimension is called Planck, length and time. And it spits out a longitudinal compressional wave at very high pressure, which can be distributed into a nodal array only, which is fractal. So if you try to do this in an aluminum building, it ain't gonna work so good. You need that dielectric constant that's called sacred space. So, but if you do this right, then you can distribute all of that inertia. Think of it, your ka becoming your ba, which is your immortal body, your astral body, or Gurdjieff called it your Kesjan body. Everybody has a name for it, but who's got the electrical engineering? That's where I come in. So when that inertia is translated efficiently into that compressional wave, it can exist out into a fractal nodal array, dodecaecosa, if and only if that is what you're embedded in. So the reason your body is so badly trying to make an effective compression black hole at the moment of death is to get your inertia compressed. Now, when our friend, I've said this many times, but it's worth repeating, that wonderful friend Danny Schreiber, who we were teaching with this Heinrich Klüver form consciousness for years with him, and then he unfortunately died of aggressive leukemia. And his lucid dreaming partner, Fiona, wonderful lady, reported back that he came back to her after death and spoke in quite some detail. My hair always stands up, always, and right now when I talk about it, that not only did he see the sequence of Heinrich Klüver during his death, but he heard the sound that went with it.
Yes. Yes.
We now know what that sound is. It's a perfect Fibonacci implosive golden ratio, low frequency infrasound heterodyne, which is actually your aura doing the infrasound necessary to make the pressure implosion work. So, and this particular side is saying when you do that, you see, it's called going to the next dimension because the number of axes of spin symmetry in your EEG in your brainwaves, here's 5 golden ratio harmonics in the brainwave, and here are the octave cascade harmonics in your heart wave. So your heart makes an octave cascade, and your brainwaves make a golden ratio cascade. And when you put them together, the 7 spins is the heart, and the 5 spins is the brain, and the 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside, called Anu, and you have that perfect implosive compression. You couldn't get a better squeeze, and you get to the next dimension. It's called ascension. So what that actually means is you've achieved charge distribution efficiency, and you can live, your memories can become immortal. In the literal sense of ancestral memory is the only reason for living, if you're an aboriginal, to exist in that realm. Dream lines, song lines, dreaming tracks. Remember, lucid dreaming enabled by this phase conjugate. So now we're getting a sense of what is the path. So what do you think?
Okay, this is all perfect, and I mean, you couldn't have read my mind better, all the areas that I wanted to touch on, but I'm going to go through it step by step just to slow it down for some people who might be new to these concepts. So look, even in a hospital, doctors notoriously report that people see that light, that pine cone. Okay, I'm going to skip to the, or just jump ahead here, because what I want to know is, would heart coherence naturally occur despite that environment because people are experiencing that divine light? And is sound actually the byproduct? You know, people often talk about, they hear the angelic, you know, music and so on.
Choirs.
Yeah, yeah, but you know, we know hygiene is so important, the astral hygiene, the spiritual hygiene, but without that, people still have these near-death experiences that they see the light and the pine cone and so on. So does that coherence come about naturally? You know, it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it because they saw the light, they went into coherence, you know, or they have to, go ahead.
Well, from an electrical engineering perspective, I believe that the amount of compression that's successful or implosive or phase conjugate or negentropic is proportional to how broad spectral is the phase conjugation. In other words,
Okay, yeah,
we say medically, you know how much immune system you have by how many harmonics are in your heart rate variability. Well, if for the harmonics in your heart or your brain to become inclusive, which is to say infinitely or fractal, means the ratio between those harmonics ultimately has to go from octave to golden ratio, because you can only superpose the next axis of spin if you use golden ratio when you go from a cube to dodeca. It's the only way to the next dimension. So
yeah,
we call ascension going to the next dimension. So
okay,
now the role of sound is your question. Remember that even Dr. Joe Dispenza, for example, who
right.
beautifully is teaching people to get to their bliss experiences together and
Mhm.
teaching them to do amazing healing by getting to that collective bliss moment in folks. It's
Mhm.
beautiful work. Unfortunately, Joe Dispenza doesn't quite go all the way with the science, of course. And one of the problems there is when he's talking about it, he doesn't admit that it's Kundalini that is teaching, but in fact he is. And so he
Right.
talks about literally the frequencies of the spine liquid pump as the motor for the kind of bliss he's teaching, which is obviously introduction to Kundalini 101, even though he won't use the word Kundalini. Oh, well,
Right.
but,
Yeah.
but the physics is important, and the physics is that we now know exactly how the low frequency of harmonics of the spine liquid pump drive the bliss Kundalini juice up into the high brain and rotate the ventral horns and all the physics of Kundalini. And all of that is at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. Point being, your breath is the drum beat. For
Uh-huh.
example, the 0.1 hertz Mayer wave breath we teach so well, iThrive.com, and that the iThrive, ITHRVE.com Facebook group is talking about nothing but
I know. I've been watching it all. It's
this
wonderful.
Mayer wave breath is so blissful. Why? Because it's the most important frequency in the blood, and it's the LF component of that famous heart rate variability, and it's the driver of the snake charm of the spine liquid pump that drives Kundalini and bliss. And the moment we get to that collective still point, and once you're in that collective implosive still point, as Dr. Joe Dispenza says very well, you can steer the tornado and you can focus on a visualization. Then you have the inertia and you're shaping a longitudinal wave. And that's
Mhm.
when you get leverage and you can heal all kinds of stuff. But the point is that for the body, pretty much you're going to need that infrasound to make the Kundalini, to make the spine liquid, to make the bliss. Those low frequency sounds are very important and they're central and they're key. Now, with the Therify and the plasma course, we start with exactly those frequencies of infrasound. The brainwave frequency is alpha, beta, theta. We take the exact golden ratio, brainwave harmonics, and those are identical with the Schumann harmonics when they're perfected, actually, which are phase conjugate tuned precisely to plot. We take that complex infrasound wave and then we drive it into the living plasma, the noble
Yeah.
gas. It's just an optical conjugator. So you have now the high frequency wave and the low frequency wave, and you got a very large pine cone all locked
Yeah.
into phase. Then you take two opposing pine cones and they kiss noses, and that's called phase conjugation in optics, but it's also called Therify. And so
Mhm.
then you have broad spectrum and you get all this naked. So you do need the sound, yes. But it's beautiful
It
and
is beautiful. Yeah, it is beautiful. Just
and that's
some people don't quite.
angel choir singing, and it's Valerie knowing which ancestor is phoning depending on which ear is ringing. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
the song
Yeah.
for all the song in the blood, it is. That's what it is. It's ancestor radio, yes.
Okay, so enlightenment is the charge that you attract then when you're thought patterns get fractal. So, but that charge is often related to grace, you know, if we wanted to go back to those kind of Christian terms and understanding, and that freedom that kind of comes with the grace. No, what is it? Forgiveness. So now are we going to talk about sin? That's just going to lead us back to the whole Enki and Lil gang and Sam and Samatea, and that was the caduceus. So I guess probably we've already covered that, but is there anything additional, you know, because in thinking about the ancestors, how far back are we going to go here?
Well,
Who are we really talking with? And are they all in our DNA, every last one of them, just at
that's
frequency, waiting for an invitation to show up?
I mean, that is the point, actually. When you get to that lightning still point, like in the movie Powder, you know, when you really sit in the middle of light, all your ancestors come to the present. You know, it's like, it's perfect sex in that sense. You know, all collective memory have converged, and there's this implosive petite mort. You know, it's a maximum bliss moment. And when you are there, it isn't about ancestors so much as what they symbolize, which is the perfect library of survival information. And DNA has been in the business of connecting that. And that library is actually an electric field. You could call it Akashic Records, or you could call it the Astral, whatever. But in fact, it's a fractal nodal array of longitudinal interferometry if you're an electrical engineer. That's what it is. And regarding what you say about grace, you know, the article I wrote on a dictionary of Jesus physics, I think it's goldenmean.info/Jesus physics, is one of the most popular, millions of people have been read our dictionary of Jesus physics, actually. And it's very simple. Yeah. The reason that the biological living plasma of collective charge is self-aware is because it knows how to survive. It's very simple. That means it's inside that wave of propagating is precisely what is a shareable wave, literally the physics of pure intention, measurable as heart coherence. And so you could regard that electric field as very intelligent and very loving. So when they say the quality of grace, they actually mean if you've located a shareable wave and you've identified with it, then literally you will attract that charge from mountains away, because all of biological charge wants to jump into you because you're the path to its survival. That's called the quality of grace. It's the collective intelligence of the living plasma field. That's what it is. And it is loving at a deep level, but it's also ruthless. That means if you're seeing through the eye of the eagle is seeing absolute precision without judgment, with simply survival in mind. So it does mean loving, but it means loving in a deep and profound sense. It's loving from the perspective of millions of years of life, that kind of loving.
That is often what they say too, is that sense of unconditional love is what's really present, and what deciding factor, do I stay or do I go? Okay. And that also, just for the people who have a little bit of hesitation about being recycled, that's also your exit point, so that you're steering ba anka and get to go where you choose, not necessarily just being recycled back into, you know, the system. What do you want to say, or do you not want to say about that?
Well, if you've located, you know, it's easy enough to say if you've located pure intent, but what do we mean electrically when we say pure intent?
Yes.
Because that's what makes you insoluble in the center of that tornado. It's what gives you identity, is identifying with enough pure intent that there's a wave that can go through that kind of lightning and come out with absolute perspective. And you know, remember, we determined that when you measure the amplitude of the cepstrum, which I discovered is the physics of the way heart coherence is measured. And by measuring that second order power spectrum, realheartcoherence.com, you have a beautiful lie detector. A lady can tell if she should say yes when he asks to marry you, because she can measure whether he's telling the truth. It is measurable because your heart literally electrically does not lie. And its form of truth is called coherence, phase coherence, which is turning into a laser, which is the introduction to this longitudinal. Ta-da. So that form of becoming shareable, which is what you have to do with your memories before you can die well. If you go to death with anger, or if you go to death with a lot of illusions about vengeance or something, that wave is not shareable at all. No.
Right.
But if you go to death with a beautiful perspective that everyone tried their best, and here's where evolution is, and here's where the path to the highest level of service could possibly be, and that's your perspective at the moment of death or dream or bliss, and it's all the same, actually. Then it's a very shareable wave, and you can propagate into that array beautifully, and the Communion of Saints radio is right there for you to talk to in the stillness.
Okay, so maybe coming back to the whole overdosing thing for the addictions counseling aspect of it, where do astral, let's look at it from the perspective of astral traveling and lucid dreaming come in. So where I'm going with this is to diminish, to neutralize the guilt that is often associated with causing a relapse. They're still carrying this old guilt. And so instead of just allowing that accountability perhaps to draw in, what am I saying here? Accountability requires or even compels awareness, whereas guilt derails the path to coherence.
Yeah, a metaphor for that might be the child who didn't come to believe there was something beautiful inside them because the parent didn't tell them. And so then at that point, the child basically has an inferiority complex for their whole life because they never believed there was something beautiful or perfect inside, and therefore something shareable, actually. And so finding that inside yourself, where you believe you have something to share to the entire universe, call it your uniqueness, call it your magic, your beauty, your perfection, whatever that was. If the parent didn't instill that in the child, then the child basically isn't able to give love because they can't receive love because they don't believe that. It's the old vicious circle. It's an old story, right?
Yes.
But once you find that in yourself, which is really ability to access the still point, that's why people who have a source of bliss, which is access to a still point inside themselves, are both able to receive and give love. But until then, love is a kind of compression they can't handle, actually, which is perfect embedding, truly. So yes, you're right. That discovery of what makes you worth saving, what makes you worth sharing, what makes you perfect, what makes you beautiful inside, that you have a contribution. Discovering that is the trigger of everything. And actually, it's interesting that, you know how young people cannot turn off their radio or their computers ever, because if they ever hear their inner voice speaking, they immediately think they're crazy. So they have to have every loud thing on outside because they can't bear to hear what's inside, because they think that would mean they're crazy. But actually the opposite is true, that the only radio worth listening to actually is in the silence inside. But the ability to bear that silence means that you have to believe in yourself.
And that again echoes the common experience that voice of unconditional love tells them or inspires them to find their sense of purpose. And then they're away once they can latch on that. Okay, so hygiene is essential for what we'd say the Mahasamadhi, right? But commonly people experience those kind of tunnels, light tunnels and so on. And so, that kind of takes us to the Ka and the Ba, knowing what feeds your aura, that biological charge, right? That's the spiritual immortality. But it still brings us back to the ancestors, Samotea, the male, the masculine, female, that sacred marriage. And so where do we land with that? Because is that just an attractive force that will naturally come into balance once we start down that path?
Well, obviously that's a, a very long story. If you want to refer to Enki Sam, remember that Enki actually consciously oversexed the humans intentionally because he figured we would be harder to enslave. But
Yes.
remember that the human genetic experiment, if you know the Pleiadian or the Andromedan history, which is another question, but we do know those histories, was a direct result of what they called the wars of expansion, sometimes called the Orion Wars. And at the heart of those wars, and even the Draco culture, the central issue was the war of the sexes, actually. The Pleiadian root of that part of the war, where Enki's family came from, was a matriarchy. And even the Pleiadians today, listen to Swaru, they won't deny they're a matriarchy, strong matriarchy. And, and why did every religion on planet Earth that was founded as a result start with fear of women? This is the story we've told 100 times. So, and it was that matriarchy at the heart of that. Now, remember that the war of the sexes in the Draco culture, which you can say it over now, but originated why the female priests and the male priests had a separate language. Anton Parks did a very good job of this, and that directly became why the female and the males of the Aboriginals have a separate language, Amensa, and this became the difference between Babylonian and the Egyptian. You can read about that in Anton Parks. And so remember, the Draco experienced that breakdown when they started replicating sexually instead of asexually, actually, and that's a very old story. And when they started replicating sexually, evolution went faster, but, and it's a very big but, wars began. And the difference between an egg and a seed, we've said many times, eggs are more fractal than seeds, but seeds can propagate charge much more powerfully because they can do the puff of pressure of the paternal. And the Kundalini for a male is very different than Kundalini for a female. Kundalini for a male goes shot at the top of your head and you might die. Kundalini for a female is much more anchored and grounded and less likely to be fatal for that reason, actually.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
And so why do we feel like we're split or broken and we have to have a sexual partner in order to be whole? Why do we feel that way? Well, let's see. That problem is 1 billion years old. Let's start there.
Yeah, let's start there.
But more complete actually is once you've achieved the implosive compression of really solid bliss, perfect Kundalini or whatever you want to call it, if you can you can experience that absolutely, then that yearning is like, it's like childishness in the distance. You know that you have access to that perfect bliss and everyone's attracted to you, of course. So if you focus on having your own source of bliss, no problem on the rest of the situation, because the only reason for Tantra is actually to achieve that implosive bliss. It's actually true. Tantra is just a name for gathering the collective plasma inertia of two so they can fuse to experience more implosive charge density. So whether you do it with one or two, it's not even important. It's beautiful either way, but you do need access to the stillness and the light.
Okay. And ideally, you've got the two within you anyway. And it's all in balance. Okay. But this is often too, we'll see that angels or seraphim are often part of the near-death experience, right? But also, what about the dragons, and the like the electric universe? What are they?
Yeah,
like portals and so on. So, I mean, this is happening multidimensionally, obviously.
Well, remember that interstellar plasma beings, the plasma universe physicists are all convinced that angels are real, and that's good.
Yeah.
And if you look at the symmetry of the angel alphabets, Ophanim Enochian, goldenmean.info/Ophanim, you see that if you extract the part of the spiral vortex and look at the shadows of the hypercube, you got Ophanim Enochian, which is how they used to make the movie Stargate, actually. Right. And all they were doing was steering plasma into perfect fusion implosion, and you walk through that door. And why is that the alphabet of angels? Literally, it's how they build their bodies. It's hyperdimensional charge compression, which is the alphabet of angels and how you build stargates, because it's the symmetry operations of donuts to get them to implode at the fusion point perfectly. And when you go through a stargate, as Billy Meyer reported, if you're angry, they have to beam you up a different way. It's far more uncomfortable, actually. Whereas if you're in a bliss state, then you made your own stargate. So actually, we know the physics of broad spectral phase conjugate making portals. We know how to make a portal, actually. This race is not quite ready for that yet, but we absolutely know that electrical engineering. They're talking about it on Gaia TV, but very few people are ready for that electrical engineering. Tom Bearden understood it. But the point is that there is a psychology as well as a physics. And talking about angels and intelligent interdimensional plasma beings requires an advanced state of advanced electrical understanding of how plasma becomes intelligent, which is why I talk so often about why it's good to learn telepathy with ball lightning. And poor Michael Sarian is there in there saying, well, John Dee was evil because he called all these big interstellar beings and they caused trouble. Well, yes, there's good ones and there's bad ones, but at least large elementals know that we're drunk until we learn how to talk to them. Yeah. And our tornadoes will not be steered until.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to get off the topic too far, but I recently had that experience, with the Kundalini, with the worm, but what the end result was, this golden column of Hebrew letters spinning. Oh my goodness, it was like it cured some curse, or it was like that DNA strand that felt like it was severed has been, anyway, okay, so.
Beautiful, nice.
Yeah, there's more. I'll tell you later. Mozart, let's go to Mozart. Mozart said that music is not so much in the notes, but rather the silence between them. But this also applies to what's really going on in those spaces between the electrical pulses we call life. Is this, what I'm thinking? Because you were talking about how the human race isn't quite ready to contain that purity, maybe, of light, literally, physically. And so what do we do to enlighten physically, so we can contain a pure, coherent, pure charge, so that.
In Sorcerer's Apprentice, the magic flute, eventually he realizes he's steering a tornado that's bigger than he thought it was. And, DNA music, Ono from Japan discovered that certain Chopin nocturnes are literally a map of DNA braiding. Like, oh, yes, there's something musical here. It's really true. But the Christian knows, any religious fundamentalist who's read the famous best-selling book series, The Left Behind, knows that you do not want to be left behind when the rapture comes. And during the rapture, the guns will melt. Well, this was good physics because it's implosive plasma density. And yes, ancestor memory will rise from the grave. It's good physics. And guns will melt because the dielectric constant of that metal cannot withstand implosive charge compression. So, there's all the myths about the rapture, and we're not ready for that, actually, are a good introduction to the electrical engineering.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we're coming so close to the end, and yet there's so many more stories to tell, Dan. We have the coherence of our aura, measurably what travels, lucid dream that you've talked about a few times. But is that the same principle for astral travel? Are there any nuances that make those two things different from each other?
Actually, there is only one way that plasma can propagate from a human. That's into the fractal array of longitudinal coherence, literally longitudinal in front. And whether you call it astral travel, remote viewing, or even remote healing with the Therapy, we've learned many things, even starting with Agnihotra. Look, these things always work better if sender and receiver are at a magnetic node cross point, whether it's a lucid dream, or whether it's astral travel, or whether it's remote healing with Therapy, or whether it's cathedrals or labyrinths or cozy of mirrors. They all need to be where the longitudinal array has a node. They call it sacred four directions. And so once you understand this longitudinal compression, you can understand so much about astral travel, remote viewing, for example, Works better at sunrise or sunset. Works better if the frequency conditions, the harmonics of the sender and receive points are matched. There are nodes that are inherently linked, and it's a simple science of this longitudinal map up where the frequency signatures are the send and receive point, the stargates, as it were. So once you begin to understand the actual electrical physics of longitudinals, you can understand this. It reminds me, we had a conversation with Laurie Monroe at the Monroe Institute. We were showing them the flameinmind.com brainwave software and trying to explain, look, you can teach remote viewing far more accurately. Not only do you need harmonics and golden ratio in the EEG, but you need a longitudinal node for sender and receiver, because that's where the radio works for human aura. And so I suggest we reinvent the concept of astral travel remote viewing based on a new science of the electrical engineering of this longitudinal grid, actually.
Okay, I like that, because here's the problem with remote viewing. I mean, it's not a problem if you don't want to be detected that you're remote viewing, but what if you're remote viewing, but you actually want to engage with, and so what's that, the equivalent of time travel? I don't know, the equivalent of multidimensional travel, but how do you match the frequency so that whom you are observing actually can also engage and observe with you? And so I did hear you say that you both have to be, but anyway, do you have...
Well, if sender and receiver have a common core emotion, if sender and or sender receiver have a common node on a strong longitudinal magnetic cross point on the grid, these kind of things are what link sender and receiver. And that's why lucid dreaming and astral travel are analogous in this sense. We know lucid dreaming was triggered by Therify. We know why. The conjugation creates longitudinal embedding, and that propagation works. But so the tests of lucid dreaming, that you actually went somewhere and experienced something you can test later, and maybe you met someone that you can talk to in the awake world and confirm. That's why lucid dreaming is such an excellent test of whether you will take memory through death. And practicing lucid dreaming is so important.
Yeah, it's really important. But in the case where you're going to different timelines, you know, it's hard to get that confirmation.
I mean, we know that you can time travel in a sense, you can return to a state of greater order, but you can never return to disorder. So
right, okay, yep, that's good.
places where very strong emotions were projected are always nodes to which you can lucid dream or time travel.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Now I'm going to quote Dan here. Get Fractal and you too will experience an acceleration of charge. Dan, tell us where we can find, you know, what it is, the App Store, the iThrive, Flame in Mind. Tell us about some of those things before we wrap up here.
Yes. Well, you know, the main website, fractalfield.com. The biofeedback, the brainwave is flameinmind.com. The heart rate variability, HRV, is iThrive, ITHRVE.com. And the EKG heart coherence is realheartcoherence.com. So you have all the biofeedback apps to help with this Bliss. And the film about using Bliss and plasma, Therify, is in the blog at therify.net.
And one other would be, I just remembered, your kind of dictionary correlating Christian terms for us. Where did they find that?
Yes, I think, I'll just check here right now, but I believe it's golden.
Or we can add it into.
No, I have it here. It's goldenmean.info/Jesus Physics.
Jesus Physics. Okay, that is so great. Gravity's definition, you said, is heaven's gate. Thank you so much for sharing a piece of heaven with us here, Dan. I appreciate it so much. And everybody, continue to join us here in the sacred space at the Shareable Wave. Anything you'd like to wrap up with, Dan?
Oh, I think you're a great example of let's be a shareable wave, Shelley, and your smile is wonderful. Let's all become shareable. We send blessings from France. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. See you again soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.